Shavua Tov. Hope everyone had a beautiful Shabbos. We're continuing with Mesilas Yesharim, the Path of the Just, and we're on a new chapter, chapter 13. So as we mentioned before, Mesilas Yesharim is a sefer written by the Ramchal, where we learn step by step how to become better Jews and better servants of Hashem. So today's a great day if you're just joining, because we're starting a new topic, which is the Midah of Precious. Precious is abstention. So let's get right into it and learn what this new step on the ladder is and how we attain it and the purpose of it and how it could benefit our lives spiritually. Ha-precious hi tchilas ha-chasidus. Precious, abstention, is the beginning of chasidus, the beginning of piety. So there is a level later called Chasidus. That's another one of the levels that we'll be talking about, but that's not what he's talking about. He's talking about general piety. Everything that we've talked about in this book until now is to become a tzaddik, a righteous person. And from now on, from this part of the book and forward, it instructs us how to become a chassid. So there's two types of pious, God-fearing people, let's say. The first level is a tzaddik. A tzaddik is a person who keeps the entire Torah, never violates any of the negative prohibitions, always fulfills all of the positive prohibitions. That's a tzaddik. A chassid, somebody who's pious, is a step beyond. He goes beyond the call of duty and does what's even not required of him. So the Ramchal says that up until here, until this section of the book, if you've mastered all of the chapters until here, you're a tzaddik. You're a totally righteous person. Because what did we learn? What attributes did we learn so far? We learned zihirus, which is being careful not to violate any negative sins, negative prohibitions, sins. We learned zrizus, which is to always be quick to fulfill all of the positive commandments. And we learned nikiyus, spiritual cleanliness, which is to have no, even a little bit, not even violate the prohibitions which are less well known, and every detail of every mitzvah we keep perfectly. So if you've reached this step, then you are a tzaddik. So not many people have even reached this step. But nevertheless, it's still important to learn what the Ramchal has to say, because we might have certain areas where we could apply the lessons we're going to learn to grow spiritually. Back in the day, they could learn this book chapter by chapter and only move on to the next chapter when they've mastered the previous chapter. But us, we're on a lower spiritual level, so we're able to, take out a little bit from each chapter and apply it to our lives. So even if we're not a total tzaddik, where we never ever violate anything in the Torah, most of us, we're not perfect, we make mistakes. Even if we're not at that level, there's still stuff that we can learn here that will benefit us. But from this point of the book onward, it's if you want to be even greater than a tzaddik, you want to be a chassid, which is a pious person. A pious person does even what God doesn't ask of him, and to get closer to him, because we see from Judaism that it's not just fulfill the Torah and that's it, get check marks and do the bare minimum to do what I have to do. But in our lives, we want to grow spiritually and we want to get closer to Hashem, because the entire purpose of life is to grow closer to Hashem by doing the mitzvos, to be selfless people, and to live for others and to live for God, to sanctify God's name, not to live a life just dedicated to selfishness in ourselves. So it's not just, you keep the mitzvahs or you don't keep the mitzvahs, but rather life is like a ladder where we're constantly growing step by step. And even a person who is a totally righteous person, he keeps the entire Torah, there's still room for him to grow spiritually and grow closer and closer to God. So this is the first step beyond being a tzaddik, beyond being a righteous person, to go the next step. V'nimsa ha-precious im ha-chasidus hu kamo ha-zihiros im ha-zrizus shezeh b'sor me'ra v'zeh b'asei tov. He says that we find that precious with chasidus is analogous to zihirus and zrizus, and one is with negatives and one is with positives. What does that mean? That zihirus, that was the first step to become a tzaddik. When a person, that's watchfulness, that's being careful never to violate any negative prohibition in the Torah. that is zihirus. That's the first step of being a tzaddik. So analogous to that is precious. Precious, we're going to learn, is refraining from things that are even allowed for us to do, but if we do them, we might somehow come to sin. So the analogy of zihirus to being a tzaddik is the same for precious, abstaining from those things which are allowed to get to that higher level. And zrizus, which we learned about before, that was the always being quick to fulfill the positive commandments in the Torah. Analogous to that, on this higher level, is chasidus. Chasidus, we're going to learn, that comes a few chapters later, that's going above and beyond when it comes to positive commandments. So precious, which we're learning now, is similar to Zehiros, relevant to the negative commandments, and Chasidus, which we'll be learning later, is analogous to Zrizus in reference to the positive commandments. V'hine, klala precious masha amru zichronim levracha. What is this idea of precious? It's like our rabbi said, Kadesh atzmecha b'mutalach, sanctify yourself with even that which is allowed to you. V'zosi harasa shel hamila atzma, and this is the explanation of the word itself. Precious. What does it mean? Rotzon lomar lios porish umarchik atzmo min hadavar, that you should separate yourself and distance yourself from something. V'hainu she'oiser al atzmo davar hater, that you forbid on yourself something which is allowed. V'akavana bazeh l'shelo yifka be'isr atzmo, and the intent is that you shouldn't violate the prohibition itself. For example, let's say you really, really enjoy McDonald's. Now, McDonald's is not kosher, so the prohibition itself is to eat in McDonald's. But let's say you love Hashem so much that you don't even want to be tempted to eat McDonald's. And sometimes when you're driving home from work, you drive by McDonald's and it just smells so good. You just smell it. And you're afraid, one day maybe you'll be really hungry after a long days of work, and you'll smell it and you might go into McDonald's. So someone who practices the midah of precious, what he might do is say, I forbid myself from driving on that particular road on the way home from work. I'm going to drive a different way so I'm not even tempted. So obviously it's totally permitted to drive down that particular road. The Torah doesn't prohibit us to drive down a road where we might smell non-kosher food. But this person, because of his love of Hashem and his fear from violating one of the commandments, makes a special rule for himself that he's not going to drive down that road so he's not tempted to violate any of the Torah. He's going to go a slightly longer way home. That would be an example of precious. Now, again, it's not something that's required from a person, but it's an extra safeguard that this person takes upon himself to not violate any of the Torah. Va'inyan shekol davar sheyuchol lehivali mimenu garmas ra, that the idea is that anything where evil could come out of it, afal pi she'achshav eino gorim lo, even though it's not happening now, v'koshachin shenin ra mamash, even though it's not actually evil, yirchak v'yish memenu, he separates himself from it. V'hizbonin v'tira sheyesh kan shalosh madregos, there are 3 levels. Yesh ha'isur ma'atzmam, there's what the Torah prohibited. That's level 1. V'yesh siagoseihem, there are the fences which are built around the Torah. V'hem hagzeros v'hamishmaros, they are the decrees and safeguards shegazru chachmeinu zivron v'racha al kol Yisrael. They're what the rabbis decreed on all of the Jewish people. For example, one can't eat chicken and cheese, even though the Torah just says one shouldn't eat meat and milk. The rabbis, according to most opinions, came along and said you can't eat chicken and milk rabbinically because often chicken and meat look similar, and if people were usually eating chicken and milk, they might make a mistake and eat meat and milk. So that's something that the Jewish people have to keep because the rabbis instituted. That's level 2. And level 3, there are safeguards that every person who practices precious, practices abstaining from things, he puts upon himself. Leos konis betoch shalo ubona gederim la'atzmo, he builds fences for himself. V'hainu lahaniach min ha'terim atzmam shelo ne'esru l'chol Yisrael, that he desists from things which are allowed for him, that is not prohibited to the rest of the Jewish people. V'lifrosh mehem, and he separates from them. Kadeshia morchak min hara herchak gadol. So you should separate from evil a great distance. So in our example, let's say the guy really likes cheeseburgers. So eating a cheeseburger is biblically prohibited, a piece of meat with cheese. The rabbis came along and said, you can't even eat chicken and cheese. Now this person might say, I have such a strong desire for cheeseburgers, I decree upon myself, or he just says in his head, that I'm never going to go down this road on the way home from work where they sell cheeseburgers because the smell might get me. So even though the rest of the Jewish people, it's totally fine, they can drive down that road, this person takes extra safeguards upon himself. And we'll discuss later on in the chapter, the Ramchal is going to discuss what are good types of safeguards, which are safeguards that we actually should not accept upon ourselves. But the idea is that even if a person is observing the whole Torah, there are still ways which he can grow. If he thinks that his whole goal in life is to get close to Hashem and to not violate anything in the Torah, then he'll want to do things that will prevent him from chas v'shalom violating a mitzvah in the Torah. I wish everyone a very good, happy, and holy week.